Hey everybody, welcome to the channel. What I want to do in this video is talk about the burden of proof. Call this video the burden of proof for dummies, and we'll give a couple examples. I like using swans, so we'll talk about black swans, whether or not black swans exist as an example for the burden of proof. And hopefully at the end I'll give you some questions that aren't necessarily answered, but maybe get you thinking a little bit more about this. Now, lots of people misunderstand the burden of proof, and I think part of it is because it isn't always taught in the most straightforward way. And this is really important because it's a starting point for good discussion, understanding when you make a claim, you bear the burden of proof, and also being aware not to shift the burden of proof onto somebody else when you are the one actually making the claim. And likewise, you don't get caught in a situation where somebody else is trying to shift the burden of proof onto you when it is really their claim that they need to provide evidence for, and likewise. So once again, just keeping your eye on the ball, because as long as both people can agree on where the burden of proof actually is, I think these conversations can be a lot more productive. It's just much more productive and much more helpful when both parties agree. And this video is going to talk a little bit about where the burden of proof lies, and we'll go from there. This also deals with issues around unbelief and disbelief. And if you don't know the difference between these two, hopefully by the end of this video, you will know the difference between unbelief and disbelief and why this distinction is pretty important. And this isn't really unbelief or disbelief in God per se. This is just unbelief or disbelief about anything in general, about any sort of claim. So let's go ahead and get started. There's white swans and black swans. We all know black swans exist, but this is actually not always the case. In Europe, back in the day, millions of swans were observed, and for centuries, all of them were white, pretty much without exception. And following inductive reasoning, one would then therefore potentially be justified in concluding that all swans are white, and that is some sort of universal truth, or that's some sort of proposition or claim. And this would have maybe been valid until January 1667. This Dutch explorer, Willem de Vlaming, actually saw, I'm hoping I'm pronouncing his name right, actually saw black swans in Australia. He was the first, I guess, from Europe. If there were people living in Australia, they probably would have seen it first. But in terms of, European knowledge, this was the first time black swans were seen. And this entire idea that all swans were white has to go in the garbage, because now we have examples of swans that are not white. Now let's look at this a little bit more closely. And I know Karl Popper used this example when he's talking about philosophy of science. Probably do a set of videos on philosophy of science. But let's look at this a little bit more closely. What's actually going on? Let's assume for the simplicity that all swans are either white or black. They're not purple or anything like that. And we can imagine around Willem's time, there would be two types of claims. There would be a positive claim, and this is the positive claim that black swans exist. And then there's the negative claim, which is no black swans exist, or if swans are either black or white, this is the same as saying all swans are white. Both of these are claims, and the person asserting either one bears the burden of proof, and this is critical here. If I'm claiming black swans exist, it is my job and my duty to provide evidence for the existence of black swans. However, if somebody is claiming that no black swans exist or that all swans are white, they also bear a burden of proof of demonstrating that claim. These are two sides of pretty much the same claim. They're both claiming knowledge about something that otherwise somebody would be in a neutral position, or what I'm going to call the AP, the agnostic position in the middle, which is basically the claim. It's not even a claim. It's just basically saying black swans may or may not exist. It's a position, not a claim, because it's not actually claiming anything that's important. It's just basically saying, I don't know, black swans may or may not exist. And these other claims are kind of opposite sides, one claiming positive and one claiming negative. So to move from the agnostic position to either the positive or the negative claim, PC and NC both bear the burden of proof of shifting somebody who's unsure or in the agnostic position to basically positive belief or disbelief. The agnostic position is unbelief. It is not positive belief, and it is not disbelief or not. It is literally a lack of belief, both positive or negative. The problem here is the claim that black swans exist is actually pretty imprecise, because it is unclear if really what's being said here is black swans exist now, or there was at least one swan that was black at some point, these sorts of things. And likewise with the negative claim as well, it's unclear if they're saying black swans can never exist, or there just aren't any black swans right now. And this is important because this reflects on what is what is needed to show either of these claims. Now what I want to do is sort of quantify what's actually being said with the positive and negative claim. So when somebody says black swans exist, what they're really doing is they're using the existential quantifier, which is this backwards E, which basically says there exists an S such that S is black. There exists a swan such that the swan is black. And basically what you're saying is I can just pick a swan and provide it for you to demonstrate that a black swan exists, and there has to be at least one to do this. And if you can't do it, then of course there are no black swans. Likewise, the claim that black swans do not exist is, you can write this either with the existential quantifier, or you can write this with the universal quantifier. So either you're saying there does not exist a swan that is black, which is the same as saying for all swans, each swan that you can think of will be white or will not be black, basically. There's kind of two sides of the same coin. And there are ways you can actually go from existential quantification to universal quantification if you want to. Now, here's something interesting, and maybe this is a little controversial. I'm going to claim that the negative claim is actually a stronger claim. And the reason for this is, to prove this claim, you have more work to do than the positive claim, everything else being equal. To prove the positive claim, all you need to do is provide one example. You provide one example of a black swan, as Willem did, and you're done. You've proven the claim. To prove the negative claim, you either need to investigate all occurrences, every single one of them, that's the for all, universal quantification, or what you need to do is show that the positive claim would somehow lead to a contradiction. And I think that's usually the route you take, is show that the positive claim leads to a contradiction. That's what we do in mathematics. When you do proof by contradiction, you generally assume the negative, and you basically show that assumption or that claim would lead to a contradiction, and that's kind of what you do. So it's much more difficult to prove the negative claim, but it's still possible, at least in principle. So that's kind of what I want to say. The negative claim is a stronger claim, and potentially it's more difficult to prove, but it's still possible in principle. So people say, oh, you can't prove a negative. That's wrong. It's just potentially more difficult. But that doesn't necessarily mean they need to be epistemically equal, per se. So how this relates to the burden of proof? Well, we have our claims, our positive claim and our negative claim. You can think of them as opposite sides, and you have the agnostic position in the middle. If you are the one making the claim, it is your job to convince, and you can imagine convincing somebody. Even if you're making the positive claim and someone else is making the negative claim, you're trying to basically move them from the negative claim to the positive claim. But the easiest way to do it is think about what evidence would convince somebody in the agnostic position to move to the positive claim. Because to convince someone to go from the negative claim to the positive claim directly, you not only need to show why the arguments for the negative claim fail, but also provide evidence on your own side, because if all those arguments fail, that just leaves you in the agnostic position. You then need to provide evidence or arguments of your own to move from the agnostic position to the side you're wanting them to move on. That's why I say the default position is the agnostic position. It's not making a claim at all. That's why when I hear people say, oh, atheism is, babies are born, everyone's born an atheist, rocks are atheists. It's like one of the stupidest things I've ever heard, to be honest. People are not born making negative claims or refuting claims. They don't even understand the cognitive content of the claim or the proposition. The default is unbelief, not disbelief. It's kind of a weird thing, but I don't understand how people miss this, which is why I guess I'm making this video. The default is not making a claim at all. It's saying it's a position. It's not a claim, I guess. And of course, arguments are needed to move from the agnostic position to either the negative claim or the positive claim. The other thing I want to say, if all arguments for the positive claim fail, you're not justified inferring the negative claim. Additional arguments are needed to move from the agnostic position to the negative claim. And that's, once again, if arguments for the positive claim fail, you are left with unbelief, not disbelief. And the same goes for the negative claim. If all the arguments for the negative claim fail, you're not justified inferring the positive claim. You need to basically have additional arguments to move from the agnostic position, where you're going to be, to the positive claim. And the other thing I want to say too, they don't necessarily have to be equal. You don't necessarily have to say, okay, I need equal evidence for one and the other. You may be justified doubting the truth of a claim, or you may be justified kind of saying, well, I really don't know. It's possible, but I'm hedging my bets over here on the negative claim, maybe for pragmatic reasons. You're fine in doing that. You're just not really logically justified in necessarily quantifying that or accepting the negative claim. If you want to positively believe or negatively believe, that's fine, but that's not necessarily like you have to be careful that that's not a logical position. And most of the time, this is the way it works. You're not dealing with proof per se. You're dealing with evidence and arguments to the best explanation. Really, it's pretty much only mathematics and a few other areas where you actually get proof itself. But burden of argumentation or burden of proof as in like displaying evidence for or an evidential case for, you need to provide that whether you're making the negative claim or the positive claim. Now, there are a couple problems related to this. And the first is that people rarely look for disconfirming evidence for their own position. And this isn't just looking for evidence for your own side, but it could be evidence that would not just disconfirm your own results, but maybe move you from making a positive or negative claim into sort of moving to the agnostic position. So this could include evidence that would lead to unbelief rather than positive or negative explicit belief. So here's the example that everyone always gives is suppose each card has a number on one side and a letter on the other. Which cards do you have to turn over if you want to know whether the following statement is false? If a card has a vowel on one side, then it has an even number on the other side. I want you to take a moment and think about this. Look at these 4 cards and think about which ones you have to turn over. A lot of people get this wrong, and hopefully you've thought about this and you've come to a conclusion, and if you need more time, you can pause the video because I'm about to tell you the answer. The answer are A and 7. Obviously, you need to check over A to see if it has an even number on the other side. But you also need to check 7 and make sure it doesn't have a vowel on the other side. Otherwise, this would disconfirm or show that the proposition, if a card has a vowel on one side, then it has an even number on the other side, is actually false. And once again, in the absence of being able to flip over these cards or whatever, you're not really justified accepting this claim or disbelieving it. I think that's pretty clear either. You don't know, like it's not that this, at this point, the statement could be true or false until you actually flip over these sorts of cards and see for these 4 cards, of course. The other thing I want to say is sometimes people try to quantify the probability of their belief. And I think this makes sense. I actually think this is a good exercise, and I try to do this all the time too. But one of the problems here is actually evaluating the probability judgment itself. And this gets into what's called the Dunning-Kruger effect, which is basically you don't know what you don't know when you're new at something. So say I make the claim, I estimate black swans exist with probability of 0.01%. I'm justified in just kind of saying that, I guess, but I haven't provided any error margins. And as a result, I haven't really quantified what the probability that my own probability calculation itself is correct. And this gets to be very difficult. In other words, what's going on here is when you haven't looked at a lot of evidence, your probability estimation itself is likely flawed. And the way I like to say it is you don't know what you don't know at a certain point. And sometimes you don't know what you do know. And that's why most of the time, your ability to have an accurate representation of your own knowledge of the subject has to kind of be calibrated as you get more experience with it. The other thing you can do is take a Bayesian approach. That's somewhere, that'd be another video for your own knowledge and using conditional probabilities, these sorts of things. But I don't want to talk about that here. Instead, what I want to do is end this video with a couple of questions that hopefully will get you thinking. None of these questions really have answers per se, but I mean, if you do answer them, you probably get a PhD because they're pretty interesting. But think about this. This is the problem of induction that David Hume talked about. Is one justified claiming all swans are white if all swans they have seen are white? Now that's an interesting question, right? Is somebody justified believing a positive claim based on just induction alone? And I'm kind of saying no. I don't think they're logically justified inferring this. I think they're pragmatically justified in believing this, but they're not logically justified in doing this because induction, there could always be an exception. And I think that's one thing we've seen. We assume all these things and then we see, oh shoot, we've been wrong before. So maybe we shouldn't be too confident in our own ability. Of course, if you keep seeing more and more and more white swans, maybe that makes your pragmatic judgment go to one side. But I don't think that really affects whether or not black swans exist. If we think about this analogy, before people went to Australia and saw black swans, if white swans in Europe had just been breeding and there were just more and more and more and more of them, that still doesn't necessarily affect the existence of black swans over in Australia. So as a result, even if you see more occurrences, it's not clear that that directly impacts the probability of black swans actually existing. And I would say maybe you're pragmatically justified in assuming, okay, the next one I see is probably going to be white, but realizing that's not a logical conclusion unless you have somehow shown that a black swan leads to a contradiction, or you've literally exhausted, all the continents, everything like that, and done it. Now here's an interesting question. Suppose all the arguments for the positive claim fail. Should this actually change your position or change your probability estimate? This is a really interesting question. So let's say you started out in the agnostic position. People provided evidence that they claimed was for black swans. Oh, here's evidence for a black swan. Here's evidence. Here's a picture. Here's this. And it turns out that every single occurrence that you had seen up until that point was either doctored evidence. It was, photoshopped. It was sent through Dolly. I don't know. Whatever people used, the people were lying for certain attention, things like that. Should this actually change your position? Should you change your probability calculations on what you think the evidence for a black swan existing are based on this? And I'm going to say no, and this is really interesting. Only if you think the existence of black swans is related in some way to these claims themselves, which in the case of black swans, it is not. If there are black swans that exist in some unexplored part of the world, it's not necessarily refuted by people showing you bad examples that don't work. Especially if there's room for doubt there. That's an interesting claim, because most people would say, okay, if people keep giving me bad examples, then I'm not going to infer that. Well, what that does is it gives you a reason for thinking that other people's claims or other people's photos would likely also be doctored. It kind of, you're playing the induction game again. You're saying, okay, all the examples I've seen so far have been false. Therefore, the next example that the next time somebody claims me this, my guess is it's also going to be false. But the problem is by accepting that, and you're justified pragmatically doing this, but by accepting that, you may actually miss a true claim about it. So it's kind of interesting. This is what's called an undercutting defeater, where basically it doesn't necessarily rebut the claim or give you reasons for accepting the alternative. It just gives you reasons for not accepting the positive claim. So if I saw a picture of a black swan and I believe the positive claim that black swans exist because somebody provided me this picture, I'm going to believe maybe that black swans exist. And then if someone else is like, no, Paul, see, look, this is photoshopped, you can tell here, blah, blah, blah. That's an undercutting defeater. It doesn't rebut the point per se, but it undercuts my reason for believing it. And as a result, I would say, okay, nobody has provided solid evidence for a black swan, but that also doesn't mean that black swans don't exist, period. So that's kind of the point I want to make here. And the same goes for negative claims as well, vice versa. And I think at a certain point, because we have finite time, you do have to sort of give up. You can't investigate every claim. Really, if you had infinite time, you would have to investigate every such report to be justified holding the negative claim, because the negative claim is very, very strong. It's saying such a thing is impossible or whatever. But I do think you're fair to make a pragmatic claim and say, okay, I've done, and you need to make sure you're being fair. You're saying, okay, I've done solid research. I've looked at all of these occurrences, and as a result, I'm drawing a practical, not a logical, but a practical conclusion that I think the next time somebody provides me with evidence for a black swan, it's going to be, it's going to also be a hoax. That's fair, but also keep in mind, and this is epistemology, what evidence would convince you otherwise? Are you open to such evidence? Are you looking at the best arguments both sides have to offer? That's really the main point of all of this. Once again, way more questions and answers, but I hope at the end of this video, you now understand the difference between unbelief and disbelief, and you understand the burden of proof a little bit better. Once again, if you're making an argument, don't shift it, and don't let anyone shift it on you when it's their job to support the claim with evidence or arguments. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video. Peace.